the caves in the game are really interesting because it's a very tonal shift within the whole visual look of the game. It's kind of like this more organic, more surreal, dreamlike landscape compared to what you're used to before this point. It's we kind of used the visuals and this kind of unreal theme very subtly, but here it's kind of at the forefront, and to me it's kind of been designed as this kind of journey through the inner self, through the body, and it's...
This for me is probably the most pivotal music cue in the game, and it's the one that most people write to me about to say that they are absolutely obsessed with and they love. It's the only music cue that has singing. It has a female voice, and I think that's a really important shift for me, that you've gone from this beautiful string music, but it's quite abstract, into what is effectively a song, and with lyrics, so you're actually explicitly saying something as a composer at this point. The other thing that I think it's important to say for me is it's the biggest shift from the music that I wrote for the mod. It's the same music, but the act of having it sung by an amazing singer. I sang it on the original and it's really bad, and Clara Sanabras re-recorded it, and it's what good actors do, it's what Nigel Carrington did, it's what good musicians do, and they take something that you've created and they just shove it up into the next level and make something that's good into something really extraordinary. And also for me, I think it's a point...
I just want to say that I think you can divide caves in games into pre and post Dear Esther. I think that it's just a way of breaking away from reality into saying what you can do with these spaces that actually makes them this incredibly, much more vividly colourful and much more kind of interpretative and look for it. And it's really interesting that I look at caves now in games and I find myself going, that's a very Rob Briscoe cave. And I think that's an amazing thing to have achieved. So I think it's one of those... It's great paying other people's work compliments. I enjoy that because you never feel like you're being big-headed about yourself. But I think it is... I think particularly it does come again down to that blend between the audio and visuals that just... It's a real high watermark. I think when you're designing a game, it's very easy to get very locked into what the system can do. And you're trying to deal with all the different variations of things. If a player does this, then this. And we have to deal with the consequence here. And our lead designer, Andrew, and I talk about this all the time, about you might have an idea, but then how does this radiate out throughout the entire system? And you get very caught in the idea of what the system has to be and how robust the system has to be and this kind of thing. And I think what's really important as a sort of a designer or as a creative is that understanding that actually the real game is happening in the player's head, and that the system can be whatever you want it to be, but if the game isn't running in the player's head as opposed to on the screen, then you're missing a trick. You're not letting the game be everything it could be. And I think the great thing about working with a game as simple as Esther in a way is that those sort of consequences of player interaction, there's not a huge... What's really important to me is that Dear Esther started out as a Half-Life 2 mod, and if the Half-Life 2 modding community hadn't championed it and celebrated it and downloaded it a lot and talked about it and loved it, then it would never have been a game. So it's never really bothered me, the kind of is it a game conversation, because as far as I can see it, Dear Esther and like everything that's come after it that's been inspired by it, this was championed by Half-Life 2 modders, and they made it what it is. And so if you've made something that...
Dear Esther was my first foray into writing music for games, and I actually approached it very traditionally, so more as a film score than a traditional interactive game music score. And what's really interesting for me is that the lack of interactivity in the music was never a problem for anybody that played the game. And that's a separate discussion, but there's a big schism between game music composers of how much the music should be following the player at all times in terms of interactive music. But one of the reasons I wanted to say something at this point was that this was my little first...
I don't know when the paper origami boats first came into things with Esther, really, but it felt like a really amazing metaphor of taking these letters and folding them into boats and then letting them leave the island, because you at this point in the game, it's kind of the realisation is there that this isn't going to end well, and that the narrator is never leaving the island. And the idea that this kind of, again, the idea of communication, or the attempt or failing communication, or trying to speak through the comb, or whatever it is, however you want to interpret it. But the idea of putting the boat in the underground river really felt like it kind of reinforced that sort of dream-like kind of quality of the caves, of actually there's something really sad about this one boat, because when you see it go past, you know that even the boats aren't going to leave the island. Like, this is something which doesn't have a tidy, neat kind of like resolution. And there's, even if you don't sort of think about it to that sort of level of depth, there's just something. It's one of those things that I really love about games that you can do, where it's just a moment that has a really distinct emotional tone to it, that you go, there's a pause when you see that boat goes past, that I just think is, yeah, it's something special you can do with kind of media like games. In a lot of ways, the caves were the hardest area of the game to actually write, because we knew we didn't want to have much voiceover in there. I think because of the strength of the music, and this goes right back to the original mod, we wanted that to be the voice and for it to be a chance for Esther to speak rather than the narrator. And we also wanted to have this break, so when the narrator came out from the caves, you had a real definite sense of something happening, and that he had changed as a result of this journey. So it meant really felt wrong to have a lot of voiceover within there, but then that made it really difficult, because then you had like 4 one-sentence lines in there, and each one of those.
The sound here is a classic case of, again, what music I think does really well, which is you've had this soft, lyrical, beautiful, epic, dreamlike music, and then the moment you come out of the caves, you're into this really harsh soundscape, and the tonal shift is very, very brutal, I think, and deliberately so. You have very little music when you come out of the caves. You hear the...
This whole area moved, didn't it? The original mod, this was a cave right at the beginning of the caves where everything was written, and it moved to the back end of the level, and we had this long corridor that's full of these kind of... It's the point of high madness, I think, in the game, isn't it?
Yeah, it's kind of just where you feel like you're losing the plot completely, both like visually and auditory, and you know, it's kind of like this really frenetic moment for me.
I think it's where you feel most that you're underneath a mountain, and you feel the weight of that mountain, and just I loved the idea when we were, you know, putting through it of what would it actually take to do this, like to actually paint all these symbols and what is going on. And it really is quite an explicit kind of thing of madness, of going, you would have to be insane or very, very disturbed to actually do this, and what is the process that this person's trying to work through, what they're trying to achieve by this. And I think it really strengthened it, making it a crawl through a tunnel as opposed to just a static location.
Yeah, I think it's the consistency and the coherence of the...
This is a bit more of a contentious one because we disagree on this one. I struggle with this. With the points in the caves where you duck above and below the water, and you have to have that transition of audio. And I love the audio on both sides of the surface tension of the water, but I really struggle with you breaking water because it's such a hard edge to the sound. And I don't think there's any other way around that. And you need to have those moments where you do go underwater because it's so important. But it's one of the areas that's never sat very comfortably with me, because I feel like in a level which hasn't got a single edge in it, it's the one edge within it that breaks me.
And that's why I think it's so successful, because you've been lured into this completely hallucinatory, dreamlike world, and then all of a sudden, as a player, you're literally gasping for breath. You're coming up for air, and I think...
The motorway scene. The biggest new addition to between the mod and the commercial version. This didn't exist. So the admission really is that I did play fast and loose with the geography of the M5. There isn't actually a welcome break service. It's just outside the junction of Sanford. But
as
we also know,
pointed out to you.
Players. I mean, what a thing if you make something that's based vaguely on somewhere in real life. In terms of a compliment, when you're getting emails from players going, there isn't a welcome break there, and people really trying to work out where is this, and whole threads about where on the M5 it is. that's just the most amazing feeling. But I think what I really love about, what I think works really, really well in Esther, and again it's something that I think is really carried forward to our other games, is that a lot of the time we're not dealing with kind of like big, glamorous, amazing, epic places. It's a sort of like a ratty little island in the Hebrides. It's someone who lived in Wolverhampton. It's just outside, you know, a service station on a stretch of the M5. And I think that earths what's going on. Gives it a realness as well, particularly when you sort of put it against the surrealness of the caves. Actually, you're kind of going, this is really surreal and this is really, really dreamlike, but actually I'm talking about, you know, a car accident just outside a little chef, and that playing off those two things against each other.
It's like making the ordinary extraordinary.
Absolutely, yeah.
This scene for me is like really, really iconic because it kind of brings this idea of the caves being an inward journey through the body together. It's really kind of like a symbol of rebirth, and it actually brings together a lot of the visual goals that I wanted to achieve with a lot of the symbolism in the game. Like I've talked a little bit about how the environment was kind of designed to provoke emotions, and kind of the impressionistic style gives you just enough information to make you think of things and feel things. But this is probably like the antithesis of this, and the whole feeling of rebirth here is quite strong. I know Jess.
Yeah, the music's really supporting that.
Yeah,
because she sings always, always throughout, you know, we've got always, always, and then she sings never, and in a moment of absolute soaring, it's the climax of the music.
As you come out of the water and the music kind of swells, and you just kind of, it is like a moment of change has happened in some way, and I
think it's rebirth, isn't it? For me, it's his moment of clarity and acceptance and understanding of the reality of what's happened.
And you're literally moving towards the light at the end of the tunnel. You're actually doing that as you go through.
But the music, especially, I think before the music got layered in, that scene was nowhere near as kind of powerful for me. Like that kind of just totally made it.
Dan and I had worked on lots of projects together, non-game projects, before we made Dear Esther. And I think the thing that links all of the projects that we've worked on together is that idea of hidden stories and layers of stories. And one of the things I wanted to do with the music was to embed hidden little hints and stories into it. So the music that you hear here has Morse code.
It's probably the level which has changed most from the original mod. I think it's much bigger than the final level in the mod. One of the major changes in there is in the original mod, the whole side of the cliff face was covered in painting and writing, and a lot of that moved inside to that corridor in the caves where it's really obsessionally painted on. And it was really, we spent so long on that because we were trying to get it looking right, because it's one of those really interesting examples where I love the image and the idea that you've got this guy painting the entire side of a mountain with words and symbols and things. But it was really interesting when it went into the rebuild.
I think one of the most fascinating things for me about planning this director's commentary has been that in previous years, when all the three of us have talked about Dear Esther, we've talked about the interpretation of the player. But actually going through this together, post having made it, we're still surprising each other. Yeah, and I think that's really, really interesting for me, because it shows that we left interpretation for each other and that we trusted each other actually just to get on with it. And because we each brought our own special and unique contribution to the game, we didn't have to in a way talk it to death or say you have to justify every idea you have or talk it to death or explain it. That Rob's idea that the island is very tainted and corrupt, and my idea that Dan didn't know that the whole level of the caves is a birth metaphor. I think it's really amazing that we're still finding out things about the game that we didn't know.
I think it was nice when I came onto it, because Dan was basically like, he gave me a bunch of materials, but he left me to my own devices for a lot of it, and we kind of like, I'd finish the level and Dan would play it and give me some feedback, but he was very kind of like hands-off at the beginning, which was really nice, kind of. So a lot of my interpretations just came through that downtime where I was just kind of like going off and doing my own thing. And so yeah, it's like interesting to hear Dan talk about it sometimes, because there's some backstory that I've never even considered before. And obviously hearing Jess talk about it as well is really interesting, especially when it comes to the soundtrack. It makes me look at things in a very different way. So yeah, it's really interesting.
I think for me, like making games is so inherently collaborative, and you have people coming together with different ideas and different takes on things, and in a way the least interesting thing you can do with that is to structure it all so heavily that there's no space for each individual person to One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of story in there. So we added in a couple of cues within the fourth level.
I'd been on holiday to Greece lots of times, and one of the things that I always really responded to emotionally was those shrines that you see on the road, and sometimes they're dedicated to saints and sometimes they're to markate where an accident has taken place. So you'll get photos of the deceased person and flowers and candles, and it always really touched me. And so I said to Rob, I think it would be amazing to get these into the game somehow, and then Rob took that idea and ran with it, and I think they're so successful and they're so beautiful and they're really moving.
One of the really nice things about the move from mod to the commercial version is that we had a couple of years worth of the community talking about the game before we went back into it again. And one of the things that I read on a forum was that someone had constructed this amazing version of the story where they'd decided that the narrator was Paul. And I hadn't thought of that. It was never part of the original writing. And I thought, that's so amazing that as a writer, your audience can find something in what you're doing that you hadn't thought of. So it was really important when we went back in to record the additional set of voiceovers. I thought, I absolutely want to do this. I want to take this idea that's come out of the fans and to run with this and to add an entire new sort of stream of
What's fascinating to me, Dan, is that you're an atheist, but each of the 3 games that we've made are so strongly about religion, either the language or taking allegories and stories. Why are you so drawn to it?
I think I'm really interested in people and the stories that make up people. And I think there is like in the Bible, like most kind of religious texts, it's not about what it is, it's about what is behind what it is, and that's what you're really getting to, is the idea of the sort of the parable or the metaphor. And it really felt like, particularly with Paul on the road to Damascus, is a story that many people know and we can understand, and it's about redemption and consequence and guilt and transformation and who you really are and what that means. And it felt like just a really strong... Is Dear Esther a depressing game or a hopeful game?
For me, it's kind of like a mix of both, really. I think, like, my interpretation is kind of like, always feel like kind of depressed when I think about the kind of turmoil that this guy's been going through for God knows how long, and the kind of environment he's been in, and, you know, all these events surrounding his story. But
So Dear Esther is the first walking simulator. How do you feel about Walking Simulator?
You know what, I think I took offence to it when it first became a thing, but you know, I think actually I don't mind it so much now. I think the fact that we have kind of taken ownership over it, like that genre has been kind of made our own by not just our game, but like a bunch of different games have kind of embraced it. I don't know, what do you guys think?
I'm still really confused about the need to categorise in games, probably more than any other creative industry, and I think it shows that games have a long way to go.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of framework, and that really...
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face, and these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world, something kind of unsettling. And yeah, a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. I didn't really want them to be like, I didn't want it to be a ghost story, so to speak, but I just kind of wanted to bring some of this supernatural element into the game, and this area is probably one of the most prominent, because you can see it just before you go down into the gully here, and I think it's really one of my favourite scenes, just because of it being so spooky, so unreal, and so interesting. One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face. And these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world, something kind of unsettling. And yeah, we've a lot of effort's been put in to make these things very subtle. I didn't really want them to be.
The last level ended up being quite a lot bigger than the original mod, and it's also the one where actually the movement around it is in a way the most artificial. There's the big zigzagging cliff paths that basically it's like a series of straight lines from point to point. There isn't a lot of movement, and one of the things that was really difficult to do with that was to not make it feel too much like a corridor and to give it that sort of sense of space and that you were actually exploring somewhere quite natural. I think, Rob, there was stuff which you put in there, like little new beat moments, like the ruins at the edge of the cliff, that just helped the player feel like they were on a journey rather than being pushed through a pipe.
Yeah, it was kind of just giving the player the reward for continuing on, and kind of still giving them some.
There's a bit of an illusion of simplicity with games like Dear Esther that people kind of assume, because there's not a lot of mechanics and there's not much going on in that sense, that they're easy to make. And I think actually it's kind of the opposite in a way, that because they're so simple, everything is exposed and everything has to be exceptionally good for it to work, because you're carrying a player's experience on a fairly sparse, minimal kind of frame.
One of the things that I think was added more frequently in the final version of Dear Esther was the inclusion of a number of ghosts in the game. These are not like ghosts that you'd see in a normal horror game. They're just very loose silhouettes that you'll see around the island, usually like quite a distance off, or just kind of somewhere that you'd barely see it out the corner of your eye. I think this is a good example of where it's kind of really in your face. And these are kind of just something that we put in to kind of not just bring some unreal elements to the island, but something supernatural as well, something that's kind of beyond this world.
The overlook, the point about this to me is that it's probably the voiceover in the game that kind of sums up the whole story and the experience. It's almost like a recap of everything that's gone before you start the final climb. And you know it's that pause before you're going to start the final climb and before the game's kind of builds to a climax. But you can also see the whole level, and it's like the idea that you are standing looking down on your own journey, a bit like the idea of your life flashing before your eyes, or sort of like seeing your body but having an out-of-body experience at the moment of death. And it was really designed to try and get that feeling as the player that you stop and you take stock of everything, and there's a bit of a sense of there's no going back. You take a breath and now it finishes. And I really wanted to kind of achieve that sort of sense, and I think
so here it kind of the environment becomes a little bit more surreal again. We kind of play with the colours a little bit, bring up the saturation. It's kind of a little bit of a return to some of the more cave-like aesthetics in terms of colours and stuff like that. And it's kind of there to kind of signpost another significant moment in the game, or something that's leading up to the significant moment. It goes back to this kind of idea of having these emotional signposts in the visuals of the game, without it being overly obvious, and some of that.
The music that's playing here is a repeat of another cue, and originally we hear it played on the piano, and the string quartet take on the piece here. And it's one of those really nice instances where we were in the studio and I had this idea of how it was going to sound, and I thought it was going to be quite full and rich and, yeah, full-bodied. And then one of the string players said to me, "This is wrong, actually."
It was possible that this last section of the game could have felt quite laborious and forced because it's 2 long zigzagging paths that just go up, and there was a real importance to getting it right. Quite a lot of work went into it. I think at this point for me, you probably as a player understand that the narrator's going to die at the end and that this is it. And that unlike where the rest of the island, there's this sense of this could just keep going on forever and ever and ever, and you're going to keep the motif of come back.
With the climb being quite a poignant moment of the game overall and of the story, it was quite a difficult task to try and make that climb still interesting and not too laborious, because it's kind of this zigzag up there with nothing really. There's no real environment. You just kind of have the sea on one side and the cliff face on the other. So there was quite a lot of work that went into kind of building up this feeling of tension as you're rising and kind of making this moment as poignant as possible while still making it interesting. So a lot of effort was put into building up this weather, building up the wind and the swaying of the grass and kind of the volume of the soundscapes and everything mixing together with the music, and just kind of visually really trying to make this a tense moment. And I think it's hopefully been pulled off all right. And you'll notice when you get to the top, this kind of tension dies, and that's very purposeful. You'll see no more wind. It's just kind of like a symbolic thing where you're coming to the last moment, the point of no return, and that's been very deliberately designed that way.
We had a lot of debates, didn't we, about the ending of the game and whether the player should retain control or whether it was okay to go to a cutscene at this point. I personally don't mind it. I actually actively like it because I think it works really well as a metaphor for loss of control at that point. Dan, I know you're not as keen.
Yeah, I'm not. I would have loved the player not to have had control taken away from them, but to me it was a balance between 2 evils. The evil of having a cutscene and the evil of the player accidentally falling off the ladder halfway up and destroying the ending.
Yeah, I agree. I think we tried a few different things, and the tech at the time just wasn't, the ladder tech at the time just wasn't there. So, and the other thing for me was pacing. It was making sure all the music, the voiceovers, the timings and everything were perfect for that final jump off point. And just letting the players kind of noodle around going up a ladder for what may have been like 7 minutes, because it's a tall tower, was kind of an impossible task.
One of the things that I enjoyed the most on working on Dear Esther was Rob's beautiful visuals were so inspiring, but Dan's words are always so amazing to write to. I think that's where we start as a partnership. And the music at the end was so easy to write because that last voiceover, it's the pinnacle of the writing to me, as it should be, because it's the last VO, so you would have failed if it wasn't good, but it is just so beautiful and moving. And for me, talking about whether it's a hopeful ending, the music is really hopeful at this point, and it signifies to me transformation, freedom, escape, acceptance. Yeah, and it was just a beautiful cue to write, actually.
I don't know, I can't remember quite where it came from in the mod, but the moment when we went, or we could put the bird in there and you could see the bird's shadow, and actually it turned from being kind of like a straightforward literal suicide into a metaphorical, or to my mind, kind of like, I always really believed the narrator did turn into a bird just before they hit the ground, and that was really important. I think it's probably the strongest ending in any of our games so far. But yeah, I'm very proud of the way everything came together in that last section.
Yeah, I think it's the bird thing is particularly interesting because I think it was in the original mod, but the timings and everything were just all off, and you never really saw the seagull. Yeah, at least the shadow is as well. It was all kind of like a little bit broken, and I remember when we went back in, I made a real effort to try and get that shadow just out of the center of the view, so you kind of have this hint of something happening, and I think you can hear the sound of a seagull flapping its wings. It's like very subtle, but like you say, I kind of really like the way that came together. It kind of it's very like say it's kind of like a release, but at the same time there's still this kind of ambiguity there that's kind of beautiful.
And I'm really proud that I got the monitor in at the end for ending of, it goes into the hospital monitor signifying the flat line. And I think it's it's one of those moments where you never want to be so clever that people notice it and it takes them out of the moment, but it just flows in through the music, and it just feels like everything comes together at that last point. That last VO, Rob's amazing visuals and the music, and it feels like a really, really strong and beautiful ending.
And then in the last second, Nigel Carrington's delivery of just those two words have come back, where he just pitch perfect.
Yeah. So that's the end of the director's commentary. We'd just like to say a big thank you to everyone for listening. We hope you've uncovered some secrets and some facts that you didn't know about the game before.
We'd also like to say a huge thank you for buying the game, and for all our fans who've been behind us and been behind the game and have kept it alive all these years. It's a real privilege that it's still out there, still such a title that people love so much.
Yeah, and we're really looking forward to the future and what we can create coming up next. Thanks for listening.
Cheers.
Bye.